In this lesson, we will look at conservation strategies that are used to protect biodiversity. We as humans can develop many strategies that can be very effective in conserving biodiversity. There are many examples of how conservation works to help prevent more damage to the atmosphere and to ecosystems, and in some cases can actually help species recover. One great example of this is looking at ozone layer depletion. The ozone layer is a layer that helps protect Earth's surface from ultraviolet light. In the past, we have seen a growing hole in the ozone layer caused by chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. These CFCs were found in things like aerosol cans and certain refrigerants. These chemicals were leaking into the atmosphere and causing a breakdown of the ozone layer. Over time, from the 70s to the 2000s, we saw this hole getting larger and larger, which allowed more and more dangerous UV light into the Earth's surface. However, in early 2000s, we had a push to eliminate CFCs and decrease the number of CFCs in production. Because of this, we have seen that ozone depletion has slowed, and in 2012, it's seen that that hole has stabilized and is not getting any larger. This is an example of how policymakers and scientists have worked together to stop increased depletion of the ozone layer and to save ecosystems. When talking about conservation, we have to look at our priorities. We need to articulate our goal and set that out in writing. What are we trying to protect? We cannot protect everything, that's a sad truth. So we need to prioritize and figure out which areas are most diverse and which areas are the most feasible to save. We can also look at which areas are most valuable. So for example, we can look at those ecosystem services and try to save places that give us the highest level of service, as well as areas that have high levels of biodiversity. After we set our priorities and our strict goals, we need to come up with a strategy. Sometimes we look at preserving specific species. Other times we look at preserving or restoring habitats as a whole. We have talked briefly before about the Endangered Species Act in the United States. This is a set of laws that not just defines endangered species, but also helps us to protect them. The Endangered Species Act can be used in conjunction with different strategies to help us conserve species. One successful story of captive breeding programs is with the California condor. These animals were down to 22 birds in the wild. These birds were brought into captivity in zoos and bred until their numbers began to increase. In 2002, we reached a milestone where a captive reared set of birds were released into the wild. This population is still low, but the species is in recovery. Many conservation strategies focus on a single species. You may have heard the logos save the insert species name here. One common one is save the pandas. So how do we choose which species best fits in that blank? There are several types of species that we can pick. One is an indicator species. These are groups that their presence confirms the overall health of an ecosystem. A good example of this would be corals in the coral reefs. If the corals are flourishing, we know that the water quality is high and there is no pollution and no problems in that ecosystem. Sometimes we choose umbrella species. These are groups that require large habitats or large spaces for them to survive and reproduce. An example of an umbrella species are the northern spotted owls. For one mating pair to reproduce, they need 800 hectares of old-growth forest. By protecting the owls in their habitat, we also preserve large tracts of forest where other organisms can live. So umbrella species allows us not to focus on one group, but actually save habitats and large amounts of diversity in an area. A third type of species is a flagship species. This is a group that are instantly recognizable. They're often big, cute, and cuddly, and people will get behind them and love to donate to these cute and cuddly critters. So one example in Florida are the Florida panthers. Everyone knows what a Florida panther is, and they are attracted to them. Most people like big cats. So this flagship species gains a lot of support. The last type of animal we will look at are keystone species. Remember, these are groups within a community that have a role disproportionate to their abundance. So, if we remove a keystone species, diversity will plummet and the community will collapse. A good example of a keystone species is a beaver. These animals alter the community by building a dam and allowing the flooding of a river. And if we remove the beavers, we see that the community will change completely. So, when we conserve or save a keystone species, we are in effect saving the diversity of an entire community. Another major conservation strategy focuses on saving habitats in general. One of the first large-scale attempts at this in the United States was the formation of Yosemite National Park. National parks are one way for us to conserve large areas of pristine habitats that many types of organisms can use. When we create these preserves or reserves, we have to think about effects of surrounding areas. Fragmentation and edge effects are two major things we have to consider. Boundaries or edges between ecosystems are defining features of landscapes. An edge has its own set of physical conditions which differ from those on the inside of our preserve. This means that an edge may not be a usable habitat for many of the species that we're trying to protect. Other times we see that certain species, like invasives, can take advantage of edges where our native species cannot. When we are designing nature preserves, we have to keep in mind connectedness of different habitats, and we have to create buffer zones to avoid this edge problem. So, when we look at preserves, we want bigger habitats, because bigger is always better, right? We've also found that circular habitats are better than long, thin ones, or even square-shaped ones. The circular habitat will actually decrease the amount of edges. When we have fragmented sections, if we can connect those fragments or small pieces of habitat using corridors, this helps the organisms stay in touch with each other and prevents isolation. We can also create buffer zones around our nature preserve to help eliminate edge effects. So this diagram shows us better and worse kind of conditions. The best types of reserves are going to be big and rounded. Smaller habitats are not as good as big ones. If we do have to have small habitats, we want to keep them close together. This allows organisms to migrate back and forth between the different areas. The further apart they are and the more fragmented our habitats are, the bigger problem we have in migration, which means those populations become isolated. Isolated small populations have a lot of problems. We also see that connecting fragments is better than leaving them separated. Okay? And the worst kind of reserve that we can possibly put together is a long, thin preserve. These have a lot of edges and not a lot of space for organisms to live. Movement corridors can be crucial for connecting fragmented habitats. Habitat fragmentation is a huge issue in today's developing nations. We see that roads, rivers, and human settlements often divide up different areas of habitat. Humans can help prevent this problem of isolating populations by leaving natural areas in between the larger chunks of habitat. In this example, the first picture, we see that there are areas of agricultural fields. The farmer has left little traces of trees in between these fields. These corridors allow native species to move back and forth in between the larger areas of habitat, like this one with the river or the larger chunk over here. This prevents isolation and keeps our populations healthy. Other types of corridors have been built over and under roadways. So this bridge goes over a road and it's natural on top with lots of plant life. This allows organisms to cross over top of the road rather than having to risk going across the road. When organisms have to cross roads, we often have car-animal interactions, also known as roadkill. These corridors over and under roads are very effective to help organisms get from one place to another and also to prevent humans from hitting the animals. Here's a review question. The presence or absence of amphibians, such as frogs, in an ecosystem is a sign of its health. If the frogs are there, we know the ecosystem is healthy. Therefore, amphibians would be categorized as blank. Take a minute to think about this question. Pause the video if you need more time to think. The correct answer is an indicator species. Amphibians indicate whether the ecosystem is healthy or not. Back to habitat conservation. One type of area that conservation biologists often try to preserve are those biodiversity hotspots we've talked about. Remember, these areas may be small, about 1% of Earth's land surface, but they house about 20% of our total diversity worldwide. So, when we conserve these areas, places like tropical rainforests, we get more bang for our buck, which means by conserving smaller areas, we're actually conserving a large amount of diversity. The last strategy we're going to look at is restoration of ecosystems. This is when humans go in and fully or partially repair or replace the habitats that were destroyed. This project can be expensive, but is often highly beneficial. Sometimes we are able to return species to the wild following captive breeding once their habitat is restored. Habitat restoration often uses bioremediation. Bioremediation uses living organisms like fungi or bacteria to help detoxify pollutants in a habitat and clean up the area. A great example of this is seen out in the Gulf of Mexico. In the Gulf, there are naturally occurring populations of bacteria that break down oil. When the BP oil spill occurred, these bacteria flourished and started eating that oil and using it for energy. Because of this, the area has been cleaned up more rapidly than we expected. There are still problems and still a lot of loss of diversity due to this giant oil spill and this disaster. But bioremediation is occurring and these living organisms are starting to help detoxify the habitat. Humans are trying to harness this kind of power and use these bacteria in other places. However, these bacteria like warmer waters, so it's very difficult to get them to clean up oil spills in colder waters and other places. We can see other types of bioremediation occurring as well. We are finding different species of fungi that can actually digest and break down styrofoam, a compound that in the past has gone to the dump and just sits and sits and sits. Styrofoam does not biodegrade. It's very hard to break it down. With this discovery of a species of fungus that can break down styrofoam, we may be able to clean up a lot of the garbage in the dumps that is not breaking down. Habitat restoration may be one of our most important types of conservation strategies in the future, especially since the number one threat to biodiversity is habitat destruction by humans. In this lesson, we have covered conservation strategies that help preserve biodiversity. Be sure to review the learning objectives posted in Blackboard to help you study for this lesson.